In the last video, I installed this Innovate MTX-D combination oil pressure and temp gauge into my car. If you want to see that video, I placed a link up here. To custom program it, you have two options. One is to buy the official Innovate serial to USB cable, which is at least $30. I opted to buy the $10 adapter from Amazon, which does the exact same thing without the luxury of having a longer cable. On my setup, the serial cable coming out of the gauge is more than long enough to reach my laptop. Make sure you connect the programming cable to the out wire coming out the back of the gauge. If you plan to enable visual alerts, you'll want to do some research and figure out the oil pressure and temperature thresholds for your specific car. Once you download the software, we're going to connect the cable and adapter to my laptop. Turn the key to on and start the LM Programmer application. You will see the letters PRG on the gauge itself. First tab is the info screen with a button to update firmware. Generally speaking, from a technical point of view, you don't want to mess with this unless you have to, meaning something isn't working right, etc. So let's jump to the second tab, pressure. Here I am leaving it at PSI because that's the more common measurement here in the US. On the bottom, there is an option for a low pressure alarm, and I highly recommend you enable this because that's the reason you have this gauge in the first place. For some cars, the factory minimum spec for oil pressure is quite low. On the Evo 8 and 9, it is 4.2 psi. At warm idle, I have never seen the psi drop below 10 on both this gauge and my old Pro Sport, so that's my threshold. I enter in 10 psi, and for some reason when you click enable, it changes to 9. If you try to change it back to 10 and hit program, it goes back to 9 anyways. Not sure why that is, but oh well. Final tab is for temp, and here we can once again choose the unit of measurement as well as how the outer LEDs are displayed. Choosing dot will be similar to the AEM wideband where only one LED is lit at a time, whereas bar will be a progression as the temp increases. Since there are no numerical readings for temp, I personally feel the bar makes more sense since it's easier to distinguish between the needle color ranges. For needle ranges, you cannot set the lowest green below 120F or the red above 280. These are the operating extremes of the sensor and gauge. For a street car, you could probably leave the default settings and be fine. For my purposes, I want the gauge to show me a rough idea of when I can start beating on the car. This quote-unquote minimum oil temp is subjective depending on who you ask. I decided to set mine around to 160. For yellow max, I am going to leave it at 250 since on the track, this is the point where oil is considered to be running hotter than desired. On the bottom, there is a section for oil temp alarm. I consider this more for track use because I cannot imagine a normal situation why your oil temp would be so high on the street. Since the maximum on the gauge is 280, I'm going to set this to 270 to 275. Here's my reasoning. Once this gauge shows red, I know oil temperatures are above 250. Once I see it flashing, then I know a cool down lap is mandatory. Once again, every driver has a different opinion on the thresholds. That's why I recommend researching this information beforehand. Hit program, exit the app, turn off the car, and unplug the cables. When you turn the key back on, you will see the gauge blinking because it is below the oil pressure limit we set, so we know it's working. Start the car and you are done. If you didn't know already, many people do not consider the oil temp gauge necessary for that scenario of knowing when you can start boosting and driving hard. Oil pressure when cold is a lot higher, and once it decreases to the known warm idle number, you know it is flowing properly. On this car, it starts at around 90 psi or more when cold, then drops to 30 psi after a few minutes, then finally 15 psi when fully warmed up. At this point, you can see the temp has reached the yellow marker that I set at 160. And that's it.